You can
too.
follow Charlie on Twitter at Charlie_Potter, 24/7 Sports, Bama Online. He's with us on the JohnstonRVCenter.com hotline. What is up, Charlie? How are you?
I'm great, guys. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we appreciate you coming on. Jim mentioned a quarterback battle in Gainesville. You don't get one of those in Tuscaloosa. However, everybody always loves some good quarterback video, and we got some video of Ty Simpson. This guy is very highly regarded. He's only had a couple spring practices, but can you glean anything from what you've seen of him?
Yeah, I think that's going to be one of the more interesting and underrated position battles for Alabama, is that backup quarterback spot, just because you mentioned that there's not a competition at the top with Bryce Young coming back. Obviously, hasn't won the Heisman Trophy, but with Paul Tyson moving on to Arizona State, Alabama doesn't have a lot of experience beyond Bryce. And, you kind of look to the future a little bit. You think that Bryce will probably turn pro after the season, so you're going to have to groom that next guy and get them ready. And, Jalen Milroe's an interesting player. I think I wrote a story last week about, players that have something to prove, and I think he's kind of the guy at the quarterback position, because he is going to be pushed by Ty Simpson. Ty's a talented player. Nick Saban had glowing things to say about him, I believe, on both signing days whenever we spoke to him in his press conference. And Ty also has the benefit of going through some playoff practices. He was the only incoming freshman that was on campus for the college football playoff, and went through some practices in Tuscaloosa. So he already has a couple of other practices under his belt, and I heard nothing but good things about him. It's early on. The first two practices so far, obviously Alabama hasn't been in full pads or anything, but early on, the young quarterbacks are usually the ones that get a lot of attention, especially the new guys. And that battle between Simpson and Milroe, I think, will be interesting to watch and to see play out, especially come A-Day on April 16th, when we actually get to see them kind of do some stuff, even though they won't be able to be sacked or hit or anything. We'll get to see them throw against competition, and that'll be interesting to see how those guys develop.
Hey, Charlie, for a team that's going to be favored to win a national championship, there's a lot of offensive questions. And, let's start with wide receiver. When you lose two guys in Jamison Williams and John Mechie that combined for 175 receptions, over 2,500 yards, people want to know who that next guy is going to be after watching basically a decade of dominant wide receivers under Nick Saban. If you had to pick, a couple of go-to guys right now, who are they?
Yeah, it's really a shame that we won't get to see Ja'Cory Brooks this spring. Nick Saban said he's not going to be out there. He's one of 3 guys that won't participate in anything this spring because of injury, and I think he would be someone that could – I still think you can pencil him in as a starter in the fall, but not having these reps and continuing to build that chemistry with Bryce Young is not ideal for him. But I think bringing in a guy like Jermaine Burton from Georgia, I don't think he was brought in just to compete. I think he's going to probably make an immediate impact. And Bryce had good things to say about him on Monday when we spoke to him. Nick Saban went out of his way to talk about the transfers after spring practice number 1, and talked about how impressive all 3 of those were. And Jermaine Burton obviously going into a position that has 3 open spots, with all 3 starters moving on, including Slade Bolden. So of the healthy guys this spring, I think the ones that can really start to lock down some spots are Jermaine Burton. Obviously, I look at a guy like Trayshawn Holden, who's going into his 3rd year in the program. You saw him some last year as a reserve, kind of one of the first guys off the bench in some games. And, he and Bryce have a strong rapport. They've been on campus the same amount of time. They've worked together, thrown together, and you can kind of tell that. I think last year's A-Day game, Trayshawn Holden led the team in targets and receptions. So he's someone that, Bryce looks to more often than not whenever, guys like Jamison Williams and John Mechie aren't on the field. So beyond that, though, it's tough. You're right. Wide receiver is a big question mark. I know a lot of fans want to see stuff from Agiye Hall, but, we'll see if he can put it together. They have some other younger players on the roster. I think Thayer Jones-Bell is another guy that's been in the program for a bit that can maybe take advantage of a guy like Ja'Cory Brooks not being on the field. But then you look at Christian Leary, JoJo Earl, the newcomers, Aaron Anderson, Kendrick Law. They're all going to have an opportunity. I think that's the big thing, is that they're going to mix guys around and see who is going to be a viable option as a receiving threat for this team. And the spring, the summer, the preseason. It's going to go a long way in deciding that because it's pretty wide open at wide receiver.
Yeah, but Charlie, we can't talk about that room without talking about attitude, right? Nick Saban put him on notice after the national championship loss in his speaking engagement. Do you expect that room to stay together, or when spring practice is over with, do you expect to see one or more guys hit the transfer portal?
Yeah, I mean, it'll obviously depend on how things play out and if guys are pleased, I guess, with their spot in the pecking order. That wouldn't shock me at all, especially in today's college football. Spring goes a long way in deciding, whether guys want to enter the portal or not. And I think wide receiver will certainly be a position to watch in Tuscaloosa. And, that's something I have a long list of questions because you guys know in these press conferences, especially now that they're back in person, it's tough to get in multiple questions from Nick Saban. But the wide receiver is at the top of my list for this evening and the future press conferences we have. And one of the things is just what does he want to see from them, not only from an on-the-field perspective, but from a maturity perspective, because you're right. I mean, I don't know if he necessarily wanted that video to get out from that Alabama coaches clinic, but it's really not anything different than he said last year. He was really looking for those wide receivers to come along and to both progress as producers in the offense, but then also just develop maturity-wise. And the way that he was disappointed in them not taking advantage of the opportunities they were given in the national championship game when Mechie and Jameson were both out. I think that says a lot about where that group stands from that standpoint.
Charlie Potter is with us on the JohnstonRVCenter.com hotline. You can follow him on Twitter at Charlie_Potter, and you can read him at Bama Online, part of 24/7 Sports. How would you handicap the race to start next to Henry To'oTo'o at that other linebacker spot?
Yeah, that's another interesting one. I think right now I'd have to give the upper hand to Jalen Moody just because he's coming back as a super senior, 1 of 2 on the team. And, he entered the portal after the season but chose to come back. And, that's a situation where if it doesn't play out the way he wants in the spring, then he could enter the portal again and look elsewhere and try to play somewhere as a grad student in his final year of college. So I would give the upper hand to him right now. But I think there's several other guys worth mentioning. I think Deontay Lawson's the first one to come to mind. Actually last year in the 8A game because they had some guys out and Henry To'oTo'o wasn't on campus yet. The 2 first-team inside linebackers for that first-team defense were Jalen Moody and Deontay Lawson. So Lawson's a guy I think this coaching staff is really high on. He still has that brace on that knee, and he had it for most of the year last year. So we'll see if that hampers him at all. But I think he's a name certainly to watch. I think Kendrick Blackshire, the second-year player, who's just a physical specimen and really made some plays on kickoff coverage last year, which is kind of where you see some of those inside linebackers start to cut their teeth a little bit, is another one. I would think DeMoy Kennedy, but he's been working some with the outside linebacker. I don't know if he's flip-flopping in between both or working solely there. But then, a young guy like Jahad Campbell. Our publisher, Tim Watts, has been high on him since he signed with Alabama. Nick Saban had nothing but great things to say about him on National Signing Day. So if there was like a newcomer, I think as a dark horse to watch, I would name him. But for me, it's Jalen Moody, and then maybe like a 1A or very close B would be Deontay Lawson.
With Alabama losing both their offensive tackles, including Evan Neal, where are J.C. Latham and Tommy Brockermeyer right now?
Yeah, I think that's something a lot of fans want to know. For me, we talk a lot about the wide receivers, but I think the offensive line is the number one question for this team going into the off season. And they just get this mainly because they don't have a lot of experience there. The interior has a lot of guys that have played first team minutes or just at least some football in Alabama uniform. So it sounds like Alabama's getting creative with guys like Kendall Randolph working some at tackle. They've moved Javian Cohen out to tackle to get a look there. They're trying to decide if a guy like Damian George can play tackle or guard. That's kind of the theme for a lot of these players. Are you a tackle or are you a guard? They're trying to see where they want to put these guys and get them to focus on a certain position. But I think J.C. Latham's right there in the mix. We've seen some of the bits of footage Alabama's put out for practice, and it looks like Latham's worked some at right guard, but he can obviously move out to tackle as well, being as big as he is. And with Tommy Brockermeyer, I think last year he was hurt a little bit. I think the second half of the season he was in street clothes, so that's never ideal. So this is a big spring for him. You would think with two offensive tackles being the top two players of their position in the country from only a year ago, that they would be able to maybe just slide in and step into those starting roles with both of them being open. But that's not necessarily the case. I think there's 5 or 6 guys that are going to be vying for those positions. I think I named all of them, maybe but Amari Kite, who's been in the program for a while now. So it's really anybody's guess at offensive tackle. I think, Kendall Randolph being a sixth-year senior coming in would be someone to certainly watch. But Alabama also doesn't have a ton of depth at tight end, and we know that Randolph's sort of filled that pseudo tight end role the last couple of years. Cohen's interesting just because he started at left guard last year, but moving him out to, left tackle, right tackle, wherever he is, maybe that opens up an opportunity for a guy like J.C. Latham to earn some first-team minutes and lock down a starting role at one of the guard spots. So it's really anybody's guess. I think it's pretty wide open on the offensive line, but that's going to be important to figure out. I mean, the two biggest question marks on offense are directly, tied to Bryce Young. You got to block for him and give him time to throw, and then he has to have somebody to throw to. And I think it's neck and neck for offensive line and wide receiver is the maybe question marks or maybe even concerns for this offense this spring.
Hats off to Brian Robinson last year. B-Rob did an amazing job. I cannot remember, and you, Charlie, you know me, I'm old. I can't remember Alabama's running back room being as thin as it was last year. How is that room as they get into spring here? Do you think it goes back to having the normal depth that a Nick Saban running back room usually has?
Yeah, more normal than last year. You're right, because you had a wide receiver, a linebacker, spending the second half of the season working with the running backs. But I think it was good that Nick Saban didn't mention Jace McClellan or Roydell Williams as guys that are going to miss all the spring. And he, made sure to temper expectations a little bit and say that, there are guys that are going to be participating in portions of practice, and they're going to see how those guys develop over time. But it sounds at the very least that both McClellan and Roydell Williams are able to do some things. I think Jace will be a guy that's, competing for that number one spot with Brian Robinson moving on. But then, adding a guy like Jahmyr Gibbs from, Georgia Tech, that's another player that wasn't brought in just to, fill a depth role. I think he's going to be someone that's going to be a big part of this offense. He's a versatile player as a runner, a receiver. He can also return kickoffs, so that'd be something else to watch. But, you got Trey Sanders back as really the most experienced returner, which says a lot because, Trey's dealt with a hell of a lot of stuff during his time at Alabama. And then you add in an early enrollee in Jamarian Miller. So, yeah, the depth is much better. I don't think it's at 100% just in terms of health. And then you're obviously going to add a guy in the summer, and Emmanuel Henderson, an in-state prospect. But, I think running back, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in A-Day because I don't know if we'll see much from McClellan and Williams. So that leaves, 3 scholarship backs. That's not a ton for an 8A game where the quarterback's not getting touched. So it's going to be plenty of opportunities, I think, nonetheless, for those guys. But, just how players like Gibbs and Sanders and some of these guys that have been banged up, how they kind of, fall in the pecking order will be pretty intriguing to follow, just given that you're right, there weren't a ton of able bodies last year, and Brian Robinson certainly carried the load for Alabama.
All right, go do this. Follow Charlie on Twitter at Charlie_Potter. Read him at Bama Online, part of 24/7 Sports. Charlie, man, thanks for the time. We appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, man. Take care. Charlie Potter covering the Alabama Crimson Tide with us on the JohnstonRVCenter.com hotline.